Fewer than 20 minutes stood between Vanessa Carter and the ceremony that was supposed to define the rest of her life when a single notification on her phone dismantled everything she believed to be true. The man positioned at the altar waiting for her was, according to a genetic test she had ordered as a light-hearted wedding gift, her biological brother. Before that same ceremony reached its conclusion, one woman would collapse in full view of hundreds of assembled guests, a buried family secret would detonate in public, and investigators would subsequently establish a fact more disturbing than the incestuous relationship itself: the groom had already possessed this knowledge before the wedding day ever began. Vanessa did not stumble onto this revelation through gossip or an overheard exchange. No one intervened to warn her in time. The truth arrived through a consumer DNA kit she had purchased as an ordinary, sentimental gesture, a small project meant to trace family lineage for fun. That innocuous decision produced the single most catastrophic moment of her existence, because when the analysis populated on her screen, it flagged her fiancé, Damien Cole, as an immediate biological relative. A full sibling. A 99.9% genetic match. Her initial reaction was disbelief, the assumption that some algorithmic or clerical failure had corrupted the results. She refreshed the application repeatedly, staring at the same static conclusion until her hands were visibly trembling. The output never shifted. Damien Cole, brother. The man she had devoted 3 years of her life to loving, the man she was scheduled to marry within hours, was confirmed to share her bloodline. Standing in isolation inside her hotel suite, Vanessa arrived at a realization that turned her stomach. Every warning sign had been present from the outset, and she had simply refused to interpret them correctly. The physical parallels between them had always registered as unusually pronounced. Identical dark eye color. Matching sharp bone structure across the face. An identical, unusual birthmark near the shoulder. Even their personalities mirrored one another so closely that mutual friends routinely joked that they behaved more like twins than romantic partners. At the time, she had dismissed those comments as harmless banter. She now understood precisely why Damien never joined in the laughter when those jokes surfaced. Evidence later uncovered in the investigation confirmed that Damien had already known the truth for weeks prior to the ceremony, and despite possessing full awareness that they were related by blood, he proceeded with wedding preparations regardless. His motivation was not love. It was not loyalty. It was access to a concealed inheritance tied to a family scandal buried for decades, one that nobody involved was ever supposed to unearth. Vanessa, in that isolated moment inside the hotel suite, was not yet aware of any of that financial motive. She could barely draw breath. Every shared memory cycled violently through her mind, every intimate exchange, every vacation, every whispered promise about a shared future. Then a second, more disturbing realization surfaced. If Damien had known the truth ahead of her, someone else had also been actively concealing it. Someone considerably closer to her than a fiancé. Someone who had spent years bearing information that should never have remained hidden in the first place. Because this entire chain of events did not originate with Vanessa and Damien. Its true starting point sat more than 25 years in the past, rooted in an extramarital affair that fractured two households, a child who vanished from the narrative without explanation, and a fabrication so structurally dangerous that it would eventually cause an entire wedding ceremony to collapse under its own weight. Before that night reached its final hour, Vanessa's own mother would stand before hundreds of witnesses and confess the entirety of it. But by the time that confession arrived, irreversible damage had already been inflicted. Vanessa Carter first encountered Damien Cole at a private charity gala held in downtown Atlanta. Neither individual understood, in that initial moment, that a single conversation would eventually dismantle both of their lives entirely. Vanessa had nearly skipped the event altogether. She had spent the preceding week buried under professional deadlines, drained from a relentless string of client obligations, and had seriously contemplated remaining home that evening. One decision reversed that trajectory. At approximately 9:30 that night, she entered the ballroom wearing a black satin dress that drew immediate attention across the room, and that was the exact moment Damien first registered her presence. Witnesses who later described the encounter characterized it not as romantic or cinematic but as unusually intense. Several guests confirmed that Damien maintained a fixed stare on Vanessa for nearly 30 seconds before crossing the room to approach her. When conversation between them finally began, observers nearby noted something distinctly abnormal almost immediately. The two behaved less like strangers meeting for the first time and more like individuals reuniting after a long separation. Their rapport carried an unnatural fluidity, an effortlessness that felt almost rehearsed. The exchange moved with a cohesion that should not have existed between two people meeting for the first time, identical senses of humor, matching opinions, shared preferences in music, cuisine, travel, even literature. The overlapping similarities accumulated with such speed that friends were already joking about it before the gala concluded. One guest later admitted the dynamic between the pair felt uncomfortably familiar, though at the time no one could articulate precisely why. Over the following months, Vanessa and Damien became functionally inseparable, and every conventional relationship milestone accelerated at a pace that, in hindsight, reads as alarming. Within a matter of weeks, Damien had already been given a key to Vanessa's condominium. Within months, the two were traveling constantly, generating a steady stream of social media content that projected the image of an ideal couple. Onlookers envied them. Friends admired them. Extended family referred to them as soulmates. Yet beneath that curated exterior, small inconsistencies kept surfacing, details that in retrospect appear impossible to overlook. Both Vanessa and Damien had been raised in single-parent households. Neither possessed substantial knowledge about their respective fathers. Whenever childhood recollections entered conversation, both families reacted with a strange, defensive posture. Direct questions were deflected. Narratives failed to align consistently across retellings. And beyond the behavioral parallels, the physical resemblance persisted, identical dark eyes, matching facial architecture, even an identical nervous habit of rubbing their hands together under stress. Initially, Vanessa attributed all of this to coincidence. Then strangers began noticing independently. Restaurant staff inquired whether they were siblings. Rideshare drivers assumed a familial relationship on site. A photographer hired for the engagement session reportedly laughed aloud and remarked that the two appeared genetically connected. Damien consistently reacted negatively to those observations, a detail Vanessa now recalls with total clarity. Each time someone raised the comparison, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a change subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless one was actively watching for it. At the time, she interpreted his discomfort as simple irritation at outsiders intruding on romantic moments. She now understands the underlying cause was considerably darker. Evidence gathered afterward confirmed that Damien had already initiated a private investigation into his own family history well before Vanessa ever ordered the consumer DNA kits, and what that investigation uncovered had frightened him substantially. Rather than terminating the relationship at that point, he accelerated the wedding timeline instead. By the second year together, Damien proposed during a luxury trip to Italy, and Vanessa accepted without hesitation. Friends observed her at what they described as the happiest point of her adult life, fully convinced she had located the ideal partner, stable, accomplished, protective, everything she believed she wanted in a spouse. While Vanessa devoted months to selecting floral arrangements, securing a venue, and researching honeymoon destinations, Damien was simultaneously conducting private meetings, receiving unexplained phone calls, and reviewing financial paperwork connected to a family trust valued in the millions. That trust would ultimately reveal itself as the genuine motivation behind the entire union. 3 days before the scheduled ceremony, a single DNA test dismantled the deception holding the relationship together. Yet even after uncovering this fundamental truth, Vanessa still failed to grasp the full depth of the deception surrounding her, because the most significant betrayal embedded in this story did not originate with Damien. It originated with the woman who had raised her. Before the entire ordeal reached its conclusion, Vanessa's mother would be forced to admit that she had spent more than 25 years actively concealing the truth of who Damien actually was. 3 days before the wedding, Vanessa unknowingly placed the definitive piece of evidence into her own possession. The DNA results populated on her device shortly after midnight, and within seconds, the version of her life she believed she was living began to unravel. Her first instinct was denial, an assumption that the results reflected a technical malfunction, a database error, anything except the literal truth, because the alternative was too disturbing to accept outright. She sat motionless on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone as the word sibling repeated itself relentlessly in her mind. Damien Cole. Immediate family match. 99.9% probability. She refreshed the results screen again and again, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device, yet the outcome never wavered. Then she heard Damien entering the apartment. For a brief interval, she considered confronting him immediately, envisioning a direct and explosive accusation. Something restrained her. Instinct intervened. Every previously unremarkable moment from their relationship began replaying through an entirely new interpretive lens, his visible discomfort whenever people joked about their resemblance, his avoidance of any conversation touching on family history, his consistent refusal to discuss his father in any detail. A singular, terrifying question crystallized in her mind: what if Damien had already known? That question altered her entire approach. Rather than confronting him that night, Vanessa concealed her discovery and behaved as though nothing had changed. Investigators later assigned to reconstruct the timeline of the wedding scandal concluded that this decision may have protected her financially, emotionally, and legally in the days that followed. That same night, while Damien slept beside her, she began quietly researching the situation independently, starting with her own mother. For years, Diane Carter had systematically avoided any discussion of the past. Questions regarding Vanessa's father consistently produced the same pattern: abbreviated responses, abrupt subject changes, emotional withdrawal. Vanessa had grown up under the belief that her father died before she was old enough to retain any memory of him. That narrative suddenly ceased to hold together under scrutiny. At approximately 3 in the morning, she entered a storage room within her condominium and retrieved several boxes of family materials her mother had handed down years earlier: photo albums, correspondence, legal paperwork, receipts, old birthday cards. She sifted through the contents for hours. Eventually, she located a faded photograph tucked inside an envelope buried at the bottom of one box. The image depicted her mother standing beside a man Vanessa had never previously seen. That alone was not what caused her physiological shock. The man photographed beside her mother was an exact visual match for Damien. Not merely similar. Not merely close in resemblance. Identical, the same eyes, the same smile, the same facial construction. Vanessa understood instantly what she was looking at. This was not Damien himself. This was his father. And that identification confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, that the DNA results were accurate. She later described that instant as the exact moment her denial permanently dissolved, because every disconnected fragment of the situation suddenly cohered into a single, unavoidable conclusion. Her mother had known this man personally. Damien bore his precise likeness. And somehow, across multiple decades, both families had actively conspired to suppress the truth. What remained unclear to Vanessa at that point was the full extent and mechanism of that concealment. So the following morning, rather than proceeding to her scheduled meeting with the wedding planner, she drove directly to her mother's residence. Witnesses interviewed after the wedding's collapse would later confirm that Diane Carter appeared visibly terrified the instant she opened her front door. Vanessa wasted no time on preamble, presenting the DNA results immediately upon entry. Diane's initial reaction was denial, insisting the test results were fraudulent, that some error had corrupted the outcome. Vanessa pressed further, then produced the photograph. That was the precise moment Diane Carter's composure fractured entirely. Witnesses later reported hearing continuous screaming emanating from inside the house for nearly an hour, because after a quarter-century of enforced silence, the complete truth was finally surfacing. Years earlier, Diane had engaged in a covert relationship with a wealthy married man named Richard Cole. That affair persisted for an extended period behind closed doors, and when Richard's wife eventually discovered its existence, both households descended into chaos. According to Diane's account, financial interest and social reputation took precedence over the welfare of the children produced from the affair. One child remained with Diane. The other was removed and absorbed into the Cole family structure. The two children were deliberately raised in complete separation from one another, each kept intentionally uninformed of the other's existence, and Diane had genuinely believed the two would never cross paths. Fate, or coincidence, ultimately reunited them regardless. Vanessa sat in total silence, absorbing her mother's confession, every fabrication, every concealed detail, every calculated decision that had destroyed 2 lives before those lives had even properly begun. Then she posed the single question that redirected the entire trajectory of the story: did Damien know? Diane's hesitation before answering was more alarming to Vanessa than the confession itself, because on some level, she already understood the answer before her mother finally whispered it aloud. Yes. Damien had known. He had possessed this knowledge for weeks. And despite full awareness that they shared blood, he had continued moving forward with the marriage regardless. Vanessa still could not identify a motive sufficient to explain that decision, until her mother disclosed one additional, decisive piece of information tied directly to the Cole family fortune, a revelation that finally explained why Damien had refused to cancel the ceremony even after confirming the biological relationship. Once Vanessa absorbed that detail, the wedding stopped functioning as a love story in her mind and was recontextualized entirely as a calculated scheme. She left her mother's house feeling as though her entire sense of identity had been dismantled within a single afternoon. Nothing in her life retained any sense of authenticity, not her relationship, not her upbringing, not even her understanding of her own family structure. For nearly 26 years, she had been living inside a fabrication meticulously constructed and maintained by the very people she trusted most. And she now confronted a genuinely disturbing conclusion: Damien had never once been confused or uncertain about the situation. He had never harbored suspicion requiring confirmation. He had known with total precision exactly who she was in relation to him. According to Diane's confession, Damien had uncovered the truth approximately 1 month prior to the wedding date. The consumer DNA test Vanessa had ordered had merely confirmed a fact he had already been independently investigating in secret for weeks beforehand. Rather than terminating the engagement upon discovering this, he proceeded to continue orchestrating the ceremony, posing for photographs, drafting vows, performing affection, all while fully aware that he and his fiancée shared identical parentage. Vanessa struggled to process the psychological implications of that decision. Her initial assumption was that Damien suffered from some form of mental instability, reasoning that no rational individual would proceed with a wedding after acquiring that knowledge. Diane then revealed the actual motivating factor: money. Specifically, a concealed family trust tied directly to Richard Cole's estate. According to Diane's account, Richard Cole had died years earlier without ever publicly acknowledging the existence of his second child. The Cole family had suppressed the scandal in its entirety. Privately, however, a legal trust instrument had been established, holding millions of dollars reserved exclusively for Richard's biological heirs. That trust carried one binding stipulation: the inheritance could only be legally unlocked through documented lineage combined with a marriage transfer connected directly to the family estate's legal structure. Damien had apparently concluded that marrying Vanessa represented his singular pathway to accessing those funds. According to Diane, his obsession with securing that inheritance intensified sharply after he discovered undisclosed financial distress within the broader Cole family business operations. Once that motive was established, every previously unexplained detail of the relationship snapped into a coherent, calculated pattern. The unusually accelerated engagement timeline. The persistent pressure to move the wedding date earlier than originally planned. The unexplained friction surrounding prenuptial agreement discussions. Even Damien's recent behavioral patterns acquired new significance in retrospect. Vanessa recalled waking on multiple occasions to find him downstairs conducting private phone calls at odd hours. She recalled his defensive reaction whenever financial topics arose in conversation. And she recalled one detail that now produced outright physical nausea: 2 weeks prior to the wedding, Damien had abruptly insisted that Vanessa add his name to several property documents scheduled to take effect following the marriage. The morning of the ceremony unfolded with no visible indication that anything was amiss. The cathedral filled with guests dressed in designer formal wear, family members exchanged laughter, and photographers circulated through the crowd documenting what everyone present assumed was the opening chapter of a promising future. At the center of the assembled crowd, Vanessa Carter presented an image of complete composure. No observer could detect the internal turmoil she was suppressing, because only 2 individuals inside that church possessed full knowledge of the underlying truth: Vanessa herself, and Damien Cole, the man standing at the altar performing the role of the ideal groom while concealing a secret capable of destroying every life connected to him. Witnesses interviewed after the ceremony's collapse later described Damien's demeanor that morning as unusually confident, relaxed, and focused, almost as though he believed the outcome had already been secured in his favor. For a period, that composure held. The ceremony proceeded through its standard sequence. Guests smiled. The vows commenced. Damien maintained direct eye contact with Vanessa while speaking of loyalty, honesty, and a shared future, language that, in hindsight, registered as thoroughly corrupted. Vanessa later admitted that hearing him recite those vows produced a more visceral disturbance than discovering the DNA results themselves, because his delivery contained no visible guilt, no shame, nothing beyond calculated control. She maintained a silence throughout, deliberately allowing him to remain comfortable, allowing the entire assembly to remain comfortable, because she understood precisely what was approaching. The officiant eventually reached the customary point in the ceremony where objections are solicited. If anyone present opposed the union, they were instructed to speak immediately or remain permanently silent on the matter. For one extended second, no one moved. The room held in complete stillness. Vanessa kept her gaze fixed on Damien. Damien continued performing normalcy. Then, abruptly, someone began crying. Not Vanessa. Her mother. Witnesses later described Diane Carter's emotional collapse as instantaneous and uncontrollable. She rose from her seat, shaking visibly, before collapsing against a nearby pew. Confused guests initially assumed she was experiencing a medical emergency. Then Diane began screaming repeatedly, "Stop the wedding, please stop the wedding." According to multiple attendees, the entire room froze the instant those words registered. The officiant retreated a step. Damien's expression shifted immediately. And Vanessa spoke publicly for the first time that day, directing a single question straight at him in front of the entire congregation: how long had he intended to marry his own sister before ever disclosing the truth to her? The room erupted into chaos. Several guests initially assumed the statement was some form of misjudged joke. Others began shouting immediately. Family members rose from their seats demanding explanation. According to witnesses, Damien did not immediately deny the accusation, and that silence alone was sufficient to terrify the assembled crowd. Diane then delivered the complete confession publicly: the affair, the concealed children, the fabricated history, the deliberate separation, 26 years of orchestrated deception exposed within less than 5 minutes. Guests began recording the unfolding scene on their phones. Screaming continued throughout the cathedral. Several family members attempted to physically remove Damien from the altar while others demanded immediate police involvement. But the detail that disturbed witnesses most severely emerged moments later. Amid the chaos, Vanessa publicly disclosed the DNA results in full view of the assembled guests. According to multiple individuals present inside the church, Damien continued attempting to defend his position, not on emotional grounds but on financial ones. Witnesses later confirmed that Damien argued the marriage needed to proceed regardless of the biological relationship, citing legal inheritance complications tied directly to the Cole estate structure. That single statement instantly recalibrated how every person present perceived him. This was no longer interpretable as a tragic accident of fractured family history. This was calculated manipulation, executed with full knowledge and deliberate intent. Vanessa later admitted she felt physically ill listening to him prioritize financial access while the entirety of both their lives disintegrated in real time around them, in front of the exact community of family and friends who had gathered believing they were witnessing a celebration rather than the public unraveling of a decades-long conspiracy built on concealment, greed, and a betrayal that reached far deeper than any single lie could contain.